let's get into the first story about the Supreme Court. Now, there are two pieces that passed in the Supreme Court that I want to focus on tonight. The first one that I want to discuss is social media, and this is going to affect all of you that use social media. I think most of you do, right? I think most of you do. I know a lot of you told me you're not on Twitter, but I think most of you are on some form of social media. Let's get started with that. Check this out, fam. The Supreme Court rules for the Biden administration in a social media dispute with conservative states. And I'm going to show you how this may affect you as well. Let's dive in and make this a little bit bigger so you can read along with me. The Supreme Court on Wednesday said with the Biden administration in a dispute with Republican-led states over how far the government, did I say said? Sided. I'm sorry. Let's start this again. The Supreme Court on Wednesday sided with the Biden administration in a dispute with Republican-led states over how far the federal government can go to combat controversial social media posts. This includes topics about the pandemic and election security. Now, why is this important other than the fact that a lot of you are on social media? It's election season. Presidential election is in November. So don't you think it's interesting that they passed this right during election season? This also reminds me of the Twitter files. This is why we go back to the Twitter files, because what did the Twitter files show us? That the Biden administration and other government officials were intervening with Twitter, and they were telling Twitter executives who to suppress, who to deplatform, and also with information. They were telling them which stories they were allowed to have on their platform. One in particular, the Hunter Biden laptop story. So the Twitter files is still very much important. Now we see what's happening with the Supreme Court. So yes, this is an effort to censor more speech, but now it has a SCOTUS ruling. By a 6-3 vote, the justices threw over lower court rulings that favored Louisiana, Missouri, and other parties in their claims that federal officials leaned on the social media platforms to unconstitutionally squelch conservative points of view. Now, another thing about this, the Supreme Court right now is a conservative court, right? So most of the justices on the Supreme Court are conservative. But this is an example where they actually ruled against the conservative base. What this shows you, and I've said it numerous times on this show, when it comes to censorship, both sides censor. Both sides are not pro-free speech. Everybody see this now. Let's continue on. Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote for the court that the states and other parties did not have a legal right or standing to sue. Justices Samuel Alito, Neil Gorsuch, Thomas, and Clarence Thomas dissented. The decision should not affect typical social media users or their posts. Yeah, we've heard this before. It goes on to say the case is among several before the court this term that affects social media companies in the context of free speech. In February, the court heard arguments over Republican passed laws in Florida and Texas that prohibit large social media companies from taking down posts because of the views they express. In March, the court laid out standards for when public officials can block their social media followers. The cases over state laws and the one that was decided Wednesday are variations on the same theme. Complaints that the platforms are censoring conservative viewpoints. So think about this for a second, guys. Big issue that a lot of people are discussing on social media right now is Israel and Gaza. So what topics do you think the Biden administration is going to tell these social media companies that they need to censor and suppress? We already know that Palestinian voices are censored and suppressed right now on Twitter. But think about how far this can go. It could get to the point where they put pressure on Elon Musk and they tell him you're not allowed to have any social media post that calls Israel an apartheid state. I could see that happening. That would be a big problem for a lot of people What about that? What about the war with Russia and Ukraine? What about calling out the military industrial complex? What about calling politicians corrupt? What about revealing the truth when mainstream media is wrong? They can anything. So think about it. What about dissenting opinions about Joe Biden? The government should not be able to intervene in social media. This is supposed to be a community space. This is supposed to be a public square. Why is the government trying to get involved and tell you what you can and cannot say? And I warned people about this when the Twitter files were released. And I know some people said, well, it seems like all the attacks are towards the Democratic Party. But in the end, all of the attacks are on us because we're the ones that will be affected by this. So the Supreme Court, whether it's a conservative court, whether it's a liberal court, regardless, they are showing you they too do not favor free speech. So we can stop it with the conservatives are pro free speech. We can stop it. They're not. As a party, they're not. That doesn't mean there aren't individuals that are pro free speech that are conservative or that are Democrat. Yes, there's always individuals. But when it comes down to it, neither party wants you to have true free speech. And now they got the SCOTUS ruling to back it. That's a problem. Pay attention to what the Supreme Court is doing. They passed a lot of rulings in June. Like I said, there's more coming on Sunday. And then we go to this one. This one is probably the most craziest thing that I've ever seen. The Supreme Court rules that state officials can engage in a little corruption. Can't even tell. Here's the Supreme Court telling you that state officials can take bribes. Let's get into it. It's a mess. Go down here. Once again, on a 6-3 party line vote, the Supreme Court ruled on Wednesday that state officials may accept gratuities from people who wish to reward them for their official actions, despite a federal anti-corruption statute that appears to ban such rewards. What the hell is this? And I promise you, I bet you a lot of people were probably so distracted by the debate last night, they don't even know this happened. So we have SCOTUS saying that it's okay for state officials to take bribes. What kind of world are we living in? There's more. Justice Brett Kavanaugh wrote the opinion in Snyder versus U.S. for the court's Republican-appointed majority. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote the dissent on behalf of the court's 3 Democratic appointees. I know, right? What the fuck is a little corruption? Oh, you can be corrupt just a little bit. Just a little bit. This is wild, fam. Okay, sorry. I shouldn't laugh. It really isn't funny. Let me continue on. Snyder turns on a distinction between bribes and gratuities. This is crazy. As Kavanaugh writes, bribes are payments made or agreed to before an official act in order to influence the official with respect to that future official act. Gratuities, by contrast, are typically payments made to an official after an official act has a token of appreciation. That's still a bribe, fam. Because here's the thing. If you know that Joe Schmo is going to pay you for voting a certain way on a piece of legislation, then you're more likely to do it. What are you talking about? This is insane. They don't even try to hide the corruption anymore. They're all out in the open with it. And the sad thing is a lot of people, though, I really believe, don't even know that this was passed. A lot of people have no idea because they're distracted by other things. Let's go on. Jesus. If that seems like a negligible difference, the facts of this case will probably only underscore that sentiment. The case involves James Snyder, a former mayor who accepted $13,000 gratuity from a truck company after the city purchased 5 trash trucks from that company for $1.1 million. Snyder claims that the money was a consulting fee, but federal prosecutors nonetheless charged him with violating an anti-corruption statute. The statute prohibits state officials from corruptly accepting anything of value from any person intending to be influenced or rewarded for an official act. As Jackson writes in her dissent, pull this up here. Everyone knows what a reward is. It is a $20 bill pulled from a lost wallet at the time of its return to its grateful owner. A surprise ice cream outing after a report card with straight A's. The bar tab picked up by a supervisor celebrating a job well done by her team. A reward often says thank you or good job rather than please. Right. But if you know there's a possibility that you are going to be rewarded for acting in such a way, you are more willing to do it. Let's go back to when we were kids. How many of you got allowance when you were growing up? I did. If I did my chores, right? So I knew that if I did my chores, I was going to get an allowance from my dad. That motivated me to do my chores on time. That's how this works, fam. This is a mess. Jackson argues that the statute should be read to prohibit rewards corruptly accepted by government officials in ways they are functionally indistinguishable from taking a bribe, much like the payment at issue in this case appears to be. Kavanaugh's opinion, meanwhile, relies heavily on policy arguments and other claims that go beyond the statute's text. He does not attempt to make a textual argument. Kavanaugh notes that the statute at issue in Snyder, like a different statute that only concerns bribes, uses the word corruptly, but his best arguments are atextual. Look at this corruptly, right? So why would they be willing to pass something like this? Because they're corrupt. Because they're corrupt themselves. That's why. It's insane. And most people aren't even talking about it. Kavanaugh's strongest argument is that the law makes it a very serious crime, punishable by up to 15 years in prison for a federal official to accept a bribe. But federal officials who accept gratuities only risk 2 years in prison. Meanwhile, the statute at issue in Snyder, which only applies to state officials, applies a 10-year sentence across the board. So Kavanaugh argues that it would be odd to read the law to draw a sharp distinction between bribes and gratuities given to federal officials, but to make no distinction when state officials accept a gift. So here's my take on this. Government officials should not be allowed to accept gratuities, since that's the word they want to use. Politicians, government officials, state officials should not be allowed to accept gratuities, period. Now, I can't even believe they're doing this. So the Supreme Court is there because they're supposed to balance the scales, right? They're the justice branch of government, supposedly. They're supposed to balance those scales to make sure that things are held and people are held accountable, right? Where the local level may have failed. But nobody is holding the Supreme Court accountable for something like this. Who overrides the Supreme Court? We got to talk about the branches of government: legislative, executive, judicial. Some would say, well, the president can step in here. Do you think the president who worked with his son in Ukraine and the business dealings that they had in Ukraine, do you think he's going to step in and stop corruption? This is crazy. This is insane. It goes on to say here, it is notable that neither Justice Clarence Thomas nor Sam Alito both of whom have accepted expensive gifts from politically active Republican billionaires, recused themselves from the case. What did I tell you? They accepted this because they are corrupt. Thomas and Alito both joined Kavanaugh's opinion, reading the anti-corruption statute narrowly. So here we have it, ladies and gentlemen. Two rulings that have been passed by the Supreme Court while people were busy doing other things, whether it was working or talking about the debate or watching the debate. The Supreme Court rules that state officials can now take bribes, or as they put it, gratuities. And the Supreme Court is backing the Biden administration and its efforts to control social media content. Wait till you hear the two for Sunday.